Yep.
So I just, yeah, no, that we want that. And we're recording this one because if you want any of that back, you can.
Cool.
We have people starting to come in. Welcome, Kim. Welcome, Malcolm. Karen. Oh, yeah, people are coming in. Quite a bit.
I got a little plug at the end, Lisa, for a book that I'm going to talk about, which people might be interested in. Great read, Of Sound Mind.
Oh, okay.
Basically, and it's really interesting. Nina Kraus, for the last 30 years, neuropsychologist, I used to say, done some fabulous work looking at how essentially sound shapes the brain and how it operates onto there. And it really is a shaping of the brain and how we operate. And it covers, you know, just about anything. You know, she's done research in all sorts of things, aging, concussion, you name it. But it's a easy, nice, she's a great science communicator, nice, easy read, and fabulously well referenced. It's just, you know, if you want to drill down, you can drill down.
So did you collaborate on that one?
No, I haven't had any collaboration with her at all. It was slightly left field. Like I was aware of her, and on one of my feeds, this book, you know, popped into there. And I thought, oh, it was well, November last year, because it came out in October or something like that. And I thought, you know, a good summer read, sort of thing. So I did. I got it and really enjoyed it. Gave it to my wife to have a read, and she really thought it was good too. So.
Is she a scientist as well?
No, she's a lawyer. So different.
Well, you know, if everybody can understand it, shouldn't just be written for those of us.
No, and that's it. And she's really good. She's written a couple of other books, but this is probably the most accessible, and it's the most comprehensive in terms of the scope of stuff she's, you know, investigated with her team. Many who have gone on to be, you know, researchers in their own right, and you know, following very specific threads of it, like aging, for example, which was increasingly with hearing loss and aging connections to dementia and so forth, panning out. So and of course there's quite a lot on how you can address or help to mitigate some of these effects. And there's some nice, robust studies around that, and some surprisingly easy things that, in principle, you could do. So it's a good read.
I went to this lecture at Parliament. The Jewish Women's League had brought out this eminent professor in Alzheimer's to do this talk. And you realize that you really do take away what is most important. So out of this hugely informative lecture, all I got is coffee good. And it's supported my addictions. You need 3 cups of coffee, and that's the only thing that has been, he could empirically prove reduces the risk of Alzheimer's is 3 cups of coffee a day. And I don't even remember the gentleman's name, but I remember he supported my addiction. Coffee good.
Okay. Yeah. It's interesting. The coffee one keeps coming back in all sorts of places. You know, but yeah, 3 seems to be in quite a lot of, not just in that space, but there's a number of other things. I've got sports science people in there who would contend a similar sort of thing when you ask about, you know, what value it might have. Well,
I started, my first job was in the U.S. Army at Walter Reed, the Army Medical Center.
Yeah.
And you are never without a cup of coffee. And I actually can tell you from anecdotally that after 8 pots of coffee, you get tinnitus.
See, there you go.
But up until 8 pots, nothing.
Nothing. Oh, God.
Nothing. And you can do 8 pots a day for
Yeah.
months and
Yeah.
not have any tinnitus. But at
Probably.
some point, so when we talk about reducing caffeine for tinnitus, I keep telling people I can do 8 pots before it even, so before it even starts the tinnitus. So unless you're drinking 8 pots, and quite frankly, if you're doing 8 pots of coffee, no.
Yeah, I just look, most of the time it's one good quality cup of coffee a day for me. That's my wife's the other end. It's one very first thing in the morning, and like it's quite a significant number. I'm not, don't need to go to fingers and toes, but you get the idea.
I do. So we are at noon, and I think we should let's get this ball rolling, since we've got quite a few people that have started attending, and I imagine people will be coming in.
Yep.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for coming to Hearing New Zealand's Lunch and Learn. I'm Dr. Lisa Syrup, and I'm president of Hearing New Zealand. And today we are hosting Dr. Wyatt Page. Dr. Wyatt Page is an associate professor of acoustics and human health in the School of Health and Sciences at Massey University here in Wellington. So we're all Wellington based today. He is involved in the delivery of environmental health and occupational health and safety programs, and is active in acoustics and sound consultancy. Co-editor of New Zealand Acoustics Journal, and a member of the International, the ISO Working Group, International Society, I should know that, organization on environmental noise. He's also worked with the World Health Organization, and today we're going to cover some of those guidelines and how they currently apply to New Zealand. We are monitoring the chat, and so if you have any questions, feel free to either add them to the Q&A or the chat, and we'll be taking those after. And we appreciate your time this afternoon. And at that point, I'm going to turn it over to Wyatt. Dr. Page.
Fantastic, Lisa. Thank you very much. Tēnā koutou katoa, no mai haere mai. Good afternoon and welcome to this talk. If you're wondering what my background is, it's a sound diffuser, at least a virtual one, and it's commonly called a skyscraper one. So you can imagine we're looking, aerial view on top of some rather tall buildings, and that's what it does. The aim is to rather than just reflect sound directly back at you, is to reflect it in a dispersed fashion, which produces a much nicer sound environment in certain settings. So that's what it looks like. If you're wondering what that is. So the talk that is going to be about World Health Organization guidelines, a little bit around its evolution and some comparison to New Zealand's current guidance. But to get us there, there's a little bit of an educational bit at the front, because I teach courses, and to help with understanding of what I'm talking about, that's where we're going to start. So first up, I usually ask the question, what do people think is noise? We're talking acoustic noise, so in one sense there's some connection to sound, and the most common common definition you'll encounter is this one. Noise is unwanted sound, and it's used in lots and lots of places. Engineers in particular, I'm an engineer, would commonly use this, but in no way does it encompass what effects noise or sound can have on you. For many years, I used this definition. This is from a former PhD student of ours, Bob Thorne, and I'll just read out. It says, noise is a sound that is audible to an individual and has definable characteristics that modify the individual's emotional and informational responses to that sound from pleasurable or neutral to adverse. So the focus is on what it does to you. If it changes you from your normal happy state and affects you emotionally and informationally in an adverse way, then we're going to call it noise, as opposed to perhaps music or some other sound. It's a bit long-winded, so for the last number of years, I distilled it down to this definition. It simply says noise is sound that results in adverse health effects. And so that's the focus that you'll see, the theme that goes throughout this talk. So what are the health effects of noise in terms of what are the parameters around it? First of all, it depends on essentially the sound pressure level. In a crude way, you might say that's how loud it is, but you know, it's quite hard to measure loudness in a robust way. How long we're exposed to it's really, really important. The longer exposed, the greater the potential health effects. And then what is the frequency content of that sound? What is it made up of? And those first three items are what a sound level meter in some way attempts to measure. But there are more items that are important. As we've just indicated, our informational and emotional response. Does it bring up our spirits? So if it's our favorite sound, favorite song, we might be happy to listen to it, so long as it's not at night when we're trying to sleep. Or does it make us a little grumpy, or even worse than that? And of course, what's our current health status? If we already have a compromised immune system, for example, then we know we're going to be more adversely affected by noise. About 6, 7, 8 weeks ago, I was run into in a car crash, suffered a bad concussion, and it took me 6 weeks before I could readjust and be able to tune out normal background sounds. So it was like everything was tuned up to max, and whether it was a car going past or someone talking to me, it was really hard going. So that's obviously it was a change in my health status that affected us. Now, this is the only slide that's got a formula in it, because when people talk about sound level measurement, people think, oh, decibels. They're the things that we measure sound in. And of course, as an engineer, this is exactly what we've done for many, many years, since the 1920s. This has been the unit for measuring it. And it involves this formula that you can see up the top on there. I'm just going to get my highlighter, and I'll just choose a suitable color onto there. So it involves this formula, and the key thing about it is you can see it's a ratio here. So we measure the pressure, the effect of the sound on the change in atmospheric pressure, and we divide it by a reference value called 20 micropascals, and then we square it, and then we put it on this logarithmic scale, and this is what we call decibels. So it's measured in decibels. If you wonder what the deci part of bell is, it's a decibel is a tenth of a bell, because the original bell from Alexander Graham Bell was just too big and chunky. And so they split up into 10 parts and we get decibels out of it. The key thing about this, as you can see from this formula sitting up the top here, is it involves a logarithm. Now, you may not have encountered logarithms for a long time at school, hopefully, onto there. But the key thing about it, it's a non-linear scale. And the reason engineers like it is it can take something that covers a really wide dynamic range from really tiny to really big, and puts it onto a scale that essentially compresses that down. So you can have values along that scale that correspond to things that are really small and also things that are really large. So that's a nice thing for many things for engineers. But because it's on this logarithmic scale, we can't simply add dB values together. So if we tried to add 80 dB plus 80 dB, it turns out we don't get 160 dB, which would be the obvious thing if you didn't know it was on decibels. We get a very modest 83 dB. And this is true anywhere along the decibel scale. If you double the sound pressure squared, then it just increases the underlying value by 3 decibels. So that's the most technical part I'm going to talk about this slide. And the takeaway message for that is that a doubling of the sound pressure squared on a decibel scale, you'll only see a 3 dB increase, and that's true anywhere along the scale. So with that in mind, what do the numbers mean? If you were in my sound laboratory and you were a trained listener, so maybe you played a musical instrument or something like that, then you're probably going to be able to determine a 1 decibel difference. But for the vast majority of you, and certainly in normal, say, office conditions, you're not going to be able to tell any difference at all. A 3 dB change you would perceive as noticeable. You may have to listen a little bit, but you'd perceive it as noticeable. By the time we get a 5 dB, you'd say that's an obvious change. And it's not till we have to increase things by 10 dB do we have subjectively, we perceive it as either being twice as loud, if it goes up by 10 dB, or half as loud. Now, this only applies for simple sounds. And so I'll give you an example. How if we consider two crying babies, and about 15 years ago, I didn't need to imagine it because I've got twin boys. Oh, got a buzz noise somewhere. Oh, actually, it's playing my tone. There we go. I'm just going to stop that. So that's just cycling through. I didn't know it automated it. In the background, that was just going through by 1 dB, 3 dB, 5 dB in the background. But let's go back to our crying babies. So 15 years ago, that's exactly what I had, twin boys. And so as we've just discovered, a 3 dB increase, so that's going from 1 crying baby to 2 crying babies, would just be noticeable. I can imagine if you said to your partner when baby 1 wakes up and cries and wants to be fed and nappy changed, and then baby 2, oh, don't worry, it's only just noticeably louder. The question is, why is it not? Well, simple calculation says it should be, and our sound level meter would just say it is, but in practice, of course, crying babies have a really significant impact on our informational and emotional response. So it turns out that although the sound level meter says it's only 3 dB up, which is just noticeable, onto the practically for you as the person at the coalface of crying baby, they're going to be more than twice as loud, as you can probably hear. Just talking about that decibel scale, so at the really quiet end of the scale, so if you want a good night's sleep, somewhere around under 30 dB is where you want to be. If you were having a normal conversation with someone at about 1 meter, 60 to 65 dB. And if you went out to a live concert, typically that's going to be around 100 decibels on this scale. So when we talk about quantifying noise, just like when we think about music, music's really complicated. Well, noise is also really complicated because remember, it's a type of sound we're talking about, and it's only how we measure it that then starts to talk about whether it's noise or sound. And so what this means is that there have been many different what are called single number, either measurement quantities or descriptors or indicators. It depends on what part of the world you're in, will depend on which of those words. But essentially you get a single number, most commonly in decibels, that tells you something about the sound. And there are lots of them. So broadly speaking, these different noise descriptors, which is my preferred way of thinking about them, they either quantify the continuous part of the sound, so that's the ongoing part, or the transitory part of the sound. They will give you some indication about the hand clap onto there. So that's broadly what they are made up of. And because our hearing doesn't respond to frequencies equally, then they are adjusted for what are called frequency weightings. And the most common ones are A, C, and Z, and they're used in all of these different descriptors. So measuring noise is not simple. And so the next slide just gives you a quick sample of commonly used descriptors. As you can see, there's quite a lot of them. Most of them are in decibels. And so the first suite up there are involving the transitory part of the sound. They're measuring the transitory, whereas the next ones are involved with the continuous part of the sound. And we're going to encounter a couple of these in the remainder, but I'm just saying all of these measure sound in a different way. Most of them are in decibels. And so when someone says it's a certain value in decibels, you have to ask the question, well, how are you measuring it? What is the noise descriptor? And that's really important when you're talking about understanding what those numbers mean. Okay, so that's the background educational bit into there. So let's have a look at these World Health Organization guidelines. So the very first guideline came out in 1999, commonly referred to as the guidelines for community noise. It was largely based on earlier research, on an early report from 1995, and it was widely adopted internationally at the time. So it was perceived as being a really important guideline document. So what did it say about noise pollution? So this is 1999, we're talking about what, 22 plus 23 years ago. It said noise continues to grow with ever increasing complaints, and that would be just as true today as it was 20 plus years ago. Growth is unsustainable because it involves direct as well as cumulative effects on health. So there's the everyday loud sounds, and then there's the effects on your health of being every day in a noisy environment. This particular guide, its definition of all noise, it focused primarily on environmental and residential noise. It did not specifically cover workplace noise. So what were some of the health effects of noise that were teased out in this 1999 guideline? Hearing loss and impairment, we've known about that for a long time. Sleep disturbance, another one we've known about for a long time. Potential for affecting speech intelligibility in noisy environments, again, something, if you've ever gone to a cafe trying to hold a conversation, you'd know about this. Effects on people's social behavior, and so in particular annoyance. And I'm going to get back to what is annoyance, particularly noise annoyance, a little bit later on in this talk. We've known about physiological effects, particularly for short, sharp sounds. And we know that there is implications for mental illness, particularly if it's coupled with sleep disturbance. And if you are exposed to multiple sources, not just a single source, then this can compound it. And last but not least, we know that there are certain vulnerable subgroups for which noise has even greater adverse health effects. So let's have a look at the two things that were covered in this. So there were a combination of specific health effects and specific environments. So if we look at the environments first, interference with speech perception, so that was one that was covered in there, hearing impairment, sleep disturbance, reading acquisition, annoyance, which I said we'll get back to, and effects on social behavior. So these were the key focus for the health effects in this guideline. Now, of course, these all occur in different environments. So the environment might be a residential dwelling, it might be a school or a preschool, it might be in a hospital setting, it might be a ceremony or a festival or some entertainment style thing. It may be you just simply wearing your headphones and listening to your favorite music, or in days gone by, it might involve toys, fireworks, and even possibly firearms. And not least, it may involve you being out going tramping, so in parkland and conservation areas. So it had a pretty wide scope of application. So in terms of noise management, what did it say? Well, the first thing it says is we should start measuring it, right? We should be monitoring the human exposure to noise, because without doing that, we do not know very clearly what the potential health effects are. And it says that there is required mitigation of noise in a number of very specific settings. So there are what we'd call noise sensitive environments. So learning establishments, schools and preschools, playgrounds, homes, and hospitals. These are all potentially noise sensitive environments, and we've got to look at noise mitigation. There are plenty of environments with multiple noise sources that we have to think about. And there are sensitive times of the day that we should be looking at, that we should be looking at preserving. So in particular at evening, when we get home from work and we want things to be a bit quieter. And obviously when we're sleeping, but also on holidays, you know, these are times which we want to preserve the quality of the soundscape. There are certain groups at high risk, children, those with hearing impaired, and others with auditory issues. Preservation of soundscapes started to become a thing. And of course, since then, we've got an international standard around defining what a soundscape is. And it says that you should adopt these guidelines. And as I said, many countries internationally did exactly that. And last but not least, it says we should adopt a precautionary actions for sustainable development of acoustical environments. So what it was saying is, here's our guidance. It's based on a limited set of studies at the time. And given what we do know, we should be taking some significant precautionary approaches to mitigate some of these effects going forward. So here is a table from the guidelines. It's an abbreviated version. And the reason I've put it in is that there's a number of environments in here that you would be very familiar with. So if we look at the very first one here, if you were outdoors and doing some gardening and you wanted to avoid serious annoyance during daytime and the evening, then this is the number you'll see, 55 dB LAEQ. That's one of the descriptors over that daytime period. If you are trying to sleep at night, so inside bedroom by your bed, then the magic number here is below 30 dB. So if you're sleeping for 8 hours, generally a good recommended thing, then by your bedside, 30 dB is where you should be aiming at. And if we want to mitigate sleep disturbance from things going crashing or bashing, then we need another descriptor, one of these ones that measures the transitory part of it. Then we want to keep that below 45 dB LAF max. If we're not in the bedroom, but we're outside the bedroom or just outside the house, then and perhaps we've got a window open, then it's 45 dB and 60 dB, because this assumes that we get some attenuation of the sound from the house. The next suite of ones coming down here all involve hearing impairment, right? So if we're talking about just general, whether it's shopping centres, traffic, those sorts of things, then if we think about being exposed to noise over a 24-hour period and we don't want it to affect our hearing, then the magic number here is 70 dB LAQ over that 24-hour period, with some additional protection from impulsive sound. If we move down a couple more onto there, we've got hearing impairment. If you're going to your favorite concert or entertainment things, then there was some guidance there that said so long as you did it no more than 4 or 5 times a year at 100 dB and it was no more than 4 hours duration, then there's a reasonable chance, so long as you had plenty of quiet time in between going to your concerts, that it would not likely to cause hearing impairment. And then you'll see some other numbers down the bottom, 84 and 85 dB. Again, these specifically relate to hearing impairment either through listening to music or through public address systems. So the numbers that are in here are numbers that you'll continue to see in many standards to this very day. So they provided a really, really important basis for it. And you'll see that many of our New Zealand standards adopted these. So before we look forward at the evolution of the other standards, I'm just going to put into place the noise limits that we have in New Zealand for environmental and occupational noise. So general noise in the environment and workplace noise. So in New Zealand, we have a general set of standards, NZS 6800, which are all about environmental noise. And number 2 of the standards, which was the guidance in there, was based on the 1999 World Health Organization guideline, has these numbers. So there's that 55 dB during daytime. That's what we want to keep it below that if we want to not get annoyed. And at nighttime for sleep protection, we've got 45 dB and 75 dB LAF max. So preventing the effects of things going bash and crash, waking you up in the middle of the night. Contrast that with the occupational setting. So we have a regulation, it's a bit dated now, but it's still current as far as the legislation says, that we have in fact 85 dB over your working day. So 85 dB for 8 hours you can be exposed to, and you can turn that into a percentage dose, which is a lot more manageable. So 85 dB for 8 hours is 100% dose. And again, we've got a second part of the criteria onto here, which is protection of your from acoustic trauma. So if you put that into mind, the things on the left-hand side are all about health protection. So the broader effects of sound or noise on health, these levels are set to minimize that. Whereas on the other side, the entire focus for these much bigger numbers is around hearing protection. And it turns out even an 85 dB 8-hour criteria doesn't imply 100% protection. If it was 100%, it would probably be something like 70 dB as we saw in the guideline. So what's the difference between 55 and 85? So every 10 dB increase is a 10-fold increase in the Pascal square component. So you go up 10, then 10, then 10. So that's 10 times 10 times 10. So the limit for occupational settings is 1,000 times in terms of the sound power than it is for environmental settings. So I'll put that in place because often I get asked the question, well, you've got this 55 on one side, 85 on the other. Why are these so different? And the reason is one's health protection, one's hearing protection, and the difference is really, really significant. Okay, so with that in mind, let's have a look more at the evolution of the guidelines for noise. One of the key things that happened at this sort of juncture in terms of the evolution is that there were a lot of changes in the World Health Organization, which meant that there in fact has not been new guidance, not for the world, as we'll see shortly, produced. But what did happen is something quite important. In July 2002, the European Union issued a directive relating to the assessment and management of environmental noise. So these are, it's commonly called the END, the European Noise Directive. And the purpose of these directives is it tells all the member countries, which I think 27, 26 with Britain now out of the equation, and requires all member states to essentially achieve whatever is required. So it's a broad requirement. So what was the purpose of this directive? So it's part of the community policies to achieve high levels of health and environmental protection. And one of the objectives in this community policy was protection against noise. It required data about environmental noise levels to be collected, collated, and reported on with a comparable criteria. Because one of the problems you have seen in studies prior to that, everybody measured sound differently. And so comparing things became really problematic. So they came up with what's called a harmonized set of indicators. They required you to have standard evaluation methods, and they also developed noise mapping tools. And I'm going to send this presentation to Lisa, and there's a number of links you'll see into this. Most of them I'm not going to have time to look at today, but if you want to look at, say, a noise map for Paris and see where are the hotspots in terms of noise day and night, then you can click on this link and go have a look. So underpinning it, they came up with a set of common indicators. And so it's these two indicators, the LDEN to assess annoyance and the L-night to assess sleep disturbance. Before we just move forward, LDEN is short for day, evening, night level. And what it does is it makes the assumption that during the evening, you come home from work, so the evening notion is defined between 7 p.m. and 10 p.m. at night, then you expect the world to be a bit quieter. And if it's not a bit quieter, you penalize it. So basically during that evening period, it adds 5 dB to your measurements. And then at nighttime, where the expectation is we should be sleeping, it says that we're going to penalize that even more. And so we add 10 dB to the night values and we get an overall average. So it has this built-in component involving your annoyance because you're awake during the evening period and sleep disturbance during the nighttime period. Okay, so with that in mind, let's have a look. So this is the suite of 3 to date, 3 major reports that really have come out as a result of the European Noise Directive. Night Noise Guidelines in 2009, Burden of Disease from Environmental Noise in 2011, and most recently in 2018, Environmental Noise Guidelines for the European region. The big thing, well, probably the difference between this and the previous guidelines for community noise is these all say Europe on them, right? And because, of course, all the data underpinning these reports is all as a result of the European Noise Directive and the work done in the European Union. It's not to say that these studies shouldn't apply elsewhere, because I would suggest that they absolutely should. It's just that because of the European Noise Directive, all of this rich set of data was collected and people began to ask questions that they couldn't ask previously. So let's have a look at the night guidelines for Europe. It was a really major update because you think the previous update on any guidance around noise was 1999 onto there. So we're talking a decade or so later. It was a major update. It was focused on night noise, so that's in particular the focus is on sleep disturbance. And as I said, it was specifically for the European region because that's where all the data was collected. And the focus was on long-term averages, so 1-year averages during that nighttime sleeping period. 10 o'clock at night is the magic number to 6 o'clock in the morning. That's the sort of normal value. It came up with this slightly awkward descriptor, L night outside. They added the outside, just emphasized that we were measuring it at night and it was outside the residential location. So with that in mind, what do we know about sound and sleep disturbance? It was already known that it probably contributed to more than 50% of the adverse health effects, although it wasn't really well quantified at that time. But sleep studies have shown us some really important information. The first thing is, of all our senses when we're asleep, the sleeping brain is relatively awake for the auditory pathway. So this means that we are in fact sensitive to noise when we're sleeping. And it makes sense that evolutionary, if you were sleeping outside or in a camp, in a cave, and somebody was going to come and raid your cave, you need a mechanism that while you're asleep is listening for potential sounds and can wake you up very, very quickly. And appropriate sounds can certainly do that. So what's the range of effects? So at 32 dB, which would be just a whisper, then what we would see if I came and whispered into your ear very gently while you were asleep, we would see some arousal and would see some increased motility. So this means you're going to start wiggling and jiggling a little bit, but you're probably not going to wake up. A little bit higher than that, 3 dB higher at 35 dB, we'll see changes in sleep structure and fragmentation of your sleep. You're not necessarily waking up, but your sleep structure's changed. At 42 dB, you will start, in fact, have some waking breaks more than would normally be the case. You either might wake, and most common thing is you'll wake up early in the morning. If there are electronic sounds present, these turn out to be really strongly arousing. They will tend to wake you up more significantly than natural occurring sounds. And most significant sounds are to voices, makes sense, you know, particularly if it's a voice you haven't heard. Snoring's a bad one there. Toilets flushing, doors opening and closing, all of those, if you are sort of primitive signals that maybe there's something I need to take attention of. So that's what we know about sound and sleep. When we are asleep, our brain is still actively listening, at least our primitive brain is. So what did they find using this outside measurement? They found that below 30 dB outside your house, there was no substantial biological effects. Now 30 dB is really, really quiet. If that was your neighborhood, you'd be really, really happy. 30 to 40 dB, a number of effects observed, but the effects seemed modest. So this was the lowest observed adverse effect. 45 to 50, this is where the adverse health effects kick in. People may be able to adapt, but vulnerable groups will be more severely affected. And above 55 dB, the words are increasingly dangerous. Adverse health effects occur frequently, and there's increased risk of cardiovascular disease, which is the big one, it turns out, for nighttime disturbance. So what did they recommend? Well, they said, ideally, we would like nighttime noise, so noise outside your house at night, to be no higher than 40 dB. But realistically, that's going to be hard. So they set this interim target of 55 dB, which is still in place today. So with that, what are some of the vulnerable groups? These are groups we've seen in the first set of guidelines from 1999. It includes children. So although children are less sensitive to sound when they're asleep, they are more reactive to it and they spend more time in bed. So that makes them a vulnerable group. If you're elderly or as you get older, your sleep tends to become more fragmented, and so therefore you're more susceptible to sleep disturbance. And if you're pregnant or have ill health, then you're also a vulnerable group. And last but not least, if you're a shift worker. And of course, the key thing about shift workers is that you are artificially shifting their sleep cycles. And so that means their whole sleep structure is under significant stress, making them a vulnerable group for noise exposure. So that is the nighttime view. So 2 years after that, in 2011, we have the really important document from the World Health Organization on the burden of disease from environmental noise. So it's the very first time that we took these numbers and tried to quantify them in an epidemiological sense about what is the impact from a disease perspective. Now, we don't normally think about noise in a disease perspective, so we're going to have to put that into place. So the overview said, like we've seen previously, health impacts from environmental noise are growing. We've seen that and it continues to be the case. And What this guideline does is that it estimated the quantitative risk between environmental noise exposure and specific health effects. So those health effects were cardiovascular disease, noise annoyance, which we'll get back to, sleep disturbance, cognitive impairment in children, which was slightly surprising, and tinnitus. All of these were part of it. I do suggest that, particularly when you get a hold of these slides, that you click on the link and have a read of the executive summary of this burden of disease guideline. So with that in mind, if you've not ever thought about burden of disease and health in a noise context, then it turns out that there are standard indicators of population health. They're used by researchers and health professionals and policymakers throughout the world. They go with all sorts of interesting, sexy names. So you've got HALES, healthy life expectancy, DALYs, disability adjusted light years, and QALYs, quality adjusted life years. So the one that the World Health Organization prefers is DALY. So what is a DALY? Because you'll see in the next slides, that's what the measurement is. So a DALY is made of two parts. It's got the YLL, so this is years lost life. So this is basically means that you haven't lived as long as you potentially could have. And adding to that is that the years that you did live have some disability component associated with. So it's made up of these two components. And so if we said that you had lost one DALY, you have essentially lost 1 year of healthy life. So that's the disease burden metric that's used throughout all of this data. So let's have a look at what they came up with. So they used, by their own estimates, conservative estimates of DALYs lost for environmental noise across the whole European Union population. And so this is the set of graphs that they came up with. And you'll see along the bottom here, there are a number of different health outcomes. So first up, just as we knew, sleep disturbance is the big one. So roughly, very close, let's call it 1 million, so 900,000 years of essentially lost through European Union due to sleep disturbance. So European Union population about 450 million. So it's not insignificant. It's a significant effect in terms of years of quality life that's lost. Annoyance, which we'll get back to, another big significant one, 39%. Heart attacks, 3.6% down there, and then cognitive impairment in children, roughly 45,000 years equivalent on there, which is about 2.7%. And the last one, very specific on there, was tinnitus, which you don't normally associate with environmental noise, but there's certainly an effect into there, about 1.3% of the total burden. Now, I don't have time to drill down to all of these, but I'm going to have a look at two in particular: noise annoyance and cognitive impairment in children. So let's have a look at noise annoyance. Now, it's after sleep disturbance, it's the most significant thing. 39% of all the overall adverse health effects of noise are due to noise annoyance. So what is noise annoyance? And more importantly, what is it in this disease burden style context? Well, it is defined. It says, if I was annoyed for noise, it would be a feeling of displeasure, nuisance, disturbance, or irritation caused by a specific noise. So it's the same sort of thing that you could apply to any sort of annoyance, but this is specifically to sound. The key focus is on long-term annoyance. We all get annoyed from day to day at work, you know it, but it's not an ongoing set of annoyance. So the key thing here, and this is we're measuring it, is if we are essentially continuously annoyed during our waking period, which you can imagine is not a good thing. How do we get this information? Well, we collect it by social or socio-acoustical surveys, and there's an international standard for doing this, which thankfully, since it was produced, most countries to collect data on it use the standard as the basis for the collection, which makes it really easy to compare results. It uses that LDEN descriptor we came across before, the day, evening, night exposure descriptor. And what it does from a modeling perspective is, on this scale, people rate their annoyance between 0 and 100%. Easy enough in some sense. But in terms of what's important, it's the highly annoyed component. So if you score your noise annoyance higher than 72 on the scale, then you would be deemed to be highly annoyed. And one of the key things we've found about noise annoyance is that there's a strong connection to causal pathways to what are called noise-induced diseases. So these are diseases that can be directly tied back to noise exposure. So one of the key things about noise annoyance, in fact, this is true of any sort of annoyance, is it's highly context dependent. The other thing is that it's highly individual dependent. What annoys one individual may not annoy another individual at all. So that's a really important part of it. And so I'll give an example of this, particularly aircraft noise, because it's some of the, probably the most controversial noise, as we'll see shortly. So if we looked at aircraft noise in the 50 to 60 dB range, so a band in there using that LDN descriptor, then we'll find that there's a normal spread of people who say they're annoyed. So even though we measure it acoustically and it's in that band, somewhere between 5% and 70%, depending on the context, and the individual will say that they are, in fact, highly annoyed in an ongoing fashion. And what this means is if you do some fancy analysis, you'll find that the acoustic properties, so basically the sound properties in the environment, only contribute 33% of the variance. So if you were trying to model it based on how annoyed someone was, just based on the measured sound levels, you could only account for 33% of it. The rest of it was dependent on context and the individual. So that makes it really, really challenging. But what I do expect we will see over the coming years as we collect more data is that big column that we saw, that's noise annoyance, that 39% block is going to be split out into specific health effects on specific populations. And so with that in mind, this is a nice segue into the other one I want to talk about, which is cognitive impairment in children. So for many years, researchers suspected that children and their learning are negatively affected by noise. I've done a lot of work in early childhood space on there, and we know that children by their very nature have difficulty tuning out distracting sounds. They don't have a mature auditory system in terms of the processing on there. And of course, they're also trying to acquire language. So language acquisition is happening. So if they're trying to do those and you're in a noisy environment, it's not surprising there's going to be some potential adverse health effects. So as a result of this study, 45,000 Delhis, so roughly 2.7% of the total burden in high-income Western countries for children in the age 7 to 19. This is a European country, so that's their children definition. Somebody's on my roof making a noise, and something fell off, because of environmental-induced cognitive impairment. So cognitive impairment in this case is defined as a reduction in cognitive ability in school children that occurs when they're exposed to excessive noise. And the interesting thing is that if you take that noise away, then the cognitive reduction persists for a significant period. And there's been a study done that says that if you take someone who was in a noisy environment, a child, and you move them to a quieter environment, then it can take typically 12 months for them to, in fact, recover that cognitive reduction. But of course, they've already been delayed in their learning. So that delay is really, really hard to catch up. So that's a really interesting result. And the only reason we've been able to find it is because, of course, we've got this rich set of data. So the very last guideline I'm going to talk about is the very latest one. It's the noise guidelines for the European region. It broadly updates the findings, and probably the most significant thing is that it looks at the quality of the evidence from the previous guidelines and what they have in place, and it puts indication of the strength of the evidence. So are we really sure that this effect occurs when we're providing a certain level of guidance? It's broad in its coverage, particularly focuses on transportation noise, so that's road, rail, and aircraft. It also includes wind turbines and leisure noise. And so, as I said, it's specifically for the European Union, but there's no reason to suspect the guideline values in here wouldn't apply anywhere in the developed world. In fact, probably the world as a whole. Now, we don't have a time to drill down in all of these, but I'm going to have a look at two of them. We're going to look at road noise and aircraft noise. And as I say, click on the link when you get the slides and have a read of the executive summary for all of these. Usually it's one page and it gives you a really good summary about what the guideline's about. So this is what you typically get when you drill down. So this is the road traffic noise and the latest guidelines. You'll see in this column over here, we have strength. So all of these are saying the evidence is really strong for the overall exposure. It's really strong in terms of the nighttime levels, and it's really strong in terms of we should do something about it. So if we have a look at the numbers, it strongly recommends that we should keep things below 53 dB LDEN associated with road traffic noise. And when we're trying to sleep at night, this should be 45 dB. And in terms of the numbers we've seen previously, if you can think back through the numbers we've had, the earlier number related to this was probably that 55 dB. And so this is a small reduction, about 2 dB reduction in comparison with previous guidelines. If we have a look at aircraft noise, and I have to say aircraft noise is the most controversial of the noise recommendations. And you'll notice through all of these, it's again suggesting the evidence is strong for a reduction during the overall 24-hour period, strong at night, and also that we should do something about it. The biggest thing is that the number in here is really significantly different. So if we went from 53 dB to 45 dB, that's an 8 dB reduction. That's a really significant reduction in the sound level associated with noise for aircraft. One of the reasons is for this big reduction is that unlike many of the other transportation noise, including rail noise, which tends to be relatively continuous, aircraft noise by its very nature is short and sharp, and it's loud. Plane takes off, makes a lot of noise, gets in the sky and goes away, or similarly when it's landing. So it's come up with these new numbers, and the big thing about it is that it's 10 dB lower than the guidance previously, because the previous guidance was just the general environmental noise guidance at about 55 dB. So this was a really substantial reduction. Now, there's been quite a lot of controversy, particularly around the noise annoyance part of this. So this is the daytime contribution to it. Nevertheless, the evidence is really strong supporting that. So how does it compare to what we have in New Zealand? So I'm just going to compare these two, road noise and aircraft noise. So in New Zealand, we actually do have a standard, NZS 6806, relatively recent standard for highways and motorway noise. The key thing about it, it only applies to those sort of roads. It doesn't apply to your suburban road. And it only applies to these highways if they are brand new, since that standard, so since 2010, or if they were altered by Waka Kotahi or NZTA, then it would apply. Otherwise it doesn't, but we'll give that as our basis. The first thing is it uses a different descriptor. I said there are lots of descriptors, and the one it uses is just this flat LAQ over 24-hour period. There's no evening penalty, there's no nighttime penalty, and it also has no nighttime limit. So if we are going to compare it to the latest guidance, which is this 53 dB LDN and 40 dB at night, we have to do a little bit of noise modeling, because there's not a direct way which we can take numbers that are measured in dB using this scale and compare it to numbers in dB using this scale. So we have to do a little bit of noise modeling. Let's assume I've done my noise modeling and I have to make a few assumptions about it. Then this is what we would come up with. So there are two categories in this standard, category A and category B. Category A allows 57 dB LAEQ over 24-hour period. So imagine 57 dB 24/7. That's what that represents, or 64 dB 24/7, 24-hour period. Now, obviously, real traffic flows past a certain period generally drop off. So with a bit of assumptions and modeling, our current New Zealand allowable road noise standards about 5 to 7 dB if we use the 57 dB criteria, or 12 to 13 dB higher if we use the 64 dB criteria. So what that's telling us is that in New Zealand, for our motorways, the allowable limits are much, much higher than the best guidance that we would have in Europe. So last but not least, let's have a look at aircraft noise. So aircraft noise, not sure why my spots jumped on there. I've got a spot on my screen jumping around merrily. Okay, so this is covered again by a New Zealand standard, NZS 6805, 1992, quite an old standard, been hanging around for a little while. Onto there. So it has 2 level criteria. The level criteria involve what was the very first standard to use linear units. So it was a standard that didn't use decibels, but it does have the equivalent values of those. So it has these 2 limits into there. There was no nighttime specification. And so if we have a look at this and compare it to what the current guidance in the European Union says, it says 45 dB LDN, 40 dB at night. Again, we have to do a little bit of modeling to put them in comparison. So what that means is in the lower limit, it's about 10 dB higher than's allowable. And in the upper limit, it's about 20 dB higher. So this is telling us that allowable levels for aircraft noise in New Zealand are much, much higher than would be allowable under the latest European guidance. So this is almost my last slide. So let's summarize what we've covered in there, because there's a lot in here and I understand that. So you might want to, once Lisa and co get the recording up, go back through it and also grab the slides that I'll send to Lisa and click on some of the links and follow them through. So larger as a result of that European noise direction or directive, we've seen essentially a rich collection of environmental noise data, which has been able to be mined and asked questions that we simply couldn't ask previously. There is various guidelines and reports from the European region. And as I say, although they say they're for the European region, there's no reason that they wouldn't apply, just like the original guidelines for community noise back in 1999. Sleep disturbance is still the single most adverse health effect of noise, and the majority of that is due to traffic noise, followed by noise annoyance. And as I said, as we get more data and we understand it more, I'm expecting that big chunk that we call the noise annoyance, which is this sort of amorphous blob, because it's really hard to quantify noise annoyance, is going to be split out into specific effects on specific populations, just like we've seen for cognitive impairment in children. And what we're seeing over time is the guideline levels continue to drop as more research is undertaken. So that's my summary of my talk. Now, the last slide I'm going to put is a little plug. If you are interested in some light reading and understanding about the mind, onto here, great book to have a look at, of Sound Mind by Nina Kraus. Really, her thesis, and she's done 30 years of research on it, is to show how sound shapes how our brain functions. She's a great science communicator, and it's a really nice read. I got it over Christmas, so it was a Christmas read. If you don't want a novel, then this is the next thing. Really well referenced, so you can drill down on lots of references if you want to. And there's a link on that slide there to a YouTube interview with her. If you're not a reading fan, maybe you want to just do a YouTube video, then that's a nice thing as well. So that's me.
I have a quick question, Wyatt, because our local legislation, the Resource Management Act, states that our descriptor for noise is that any noise that's under human control that unreasonably interferes with the peace, comfort, and convenience of a person,
yep,
is considered to be outside noise guidelines. I know from a Wellington perspective, one of the noise control officers said the biggest complaint he gets is heat pumps.
Yep.
And because it interferes with that sleep, they're actually able to get them to move those heat pumps.
Indeed, yeah. And the guidance numbers that they refer to, because the RMA has no numbers. It has 2 things. It has unreasonable noise with a definition. It has quite a specific definition for excessive noise, but this is generally not in that space. And so what we do for that situation, and I'm sure the local Wellington Council, is they will refer back to the guidance provided in NZS 602, which is this 55 dB daytime, and that's and also 45 dB at night. And so they would do some measurements and then say, is this unreasonable? And that's the criteria they would apply to use the RMA, and they would use their district plan requirements to basically, exactly as you said, do one of the things, either move the heat pump, because one of the things about heat pumps is you see Mitsubishi with their adverts saying it's the quietest, you whisper inside. What they forget about is that thing on the outside that's outside your house, which is essentially pulling air through it, is making a lot of noise. And in fact, when you buy a heat pump and you look at its performance and character, you can get quieter ones. The outside one can be also selected just like the inside one. There are quieter units, and of course their placement's important in terms of if it's outside a neighbour's window. And in Wellington here, where our houses are really tight together, that's a really, really important issue. But you can also get acoustic cages for them. So basically specially designed acoustic enclosure that they go in that still allows them to perform as they're expected, but also quietens them down substantially. So there's a number of solutions for that heat pump scenario.
But does annoyance noise really correlate very well with dB level? Because
no, it does not. No, not at all. That's the key thing about annoyance. Because, and as you would find, it's very dependent on your health status. As I was indicating earlier on when I had the concussion, I would think everything was annoying and noisy for weeks and weeks until I eventually could figure out, at least my brain was recovering onto there, that it could tune out that other stuff. But everything was annoying to me. My wife having a conversation at normal distance sounded like she was shouting at me continuously. And I know she wasn't, but that's what my perception of it was.
I'm going to open it up to anybody that does have any questions. Nicholas said the tonal component of nighttime noise can be more annoying than the time-weighted average dB of the low-frequency noise. Yep,
indeed so. And so within standards like NZS 6805, you have a penalty thing called special audible characteristics. And one of the elements in there is tonality. So basically, if something's got a very tonal means that it's, a tone would be something if it had a hum or a whistle, it has a really narrow band of frequencies, which makes it more annoying. And so there is a penalty up to 5 dB that can be applied for tonality. Generally speaking, tonality in certain devices is a result of how it's been designed. And again, you can get devices that have similar levels that are relatively free from tonal components. So it's around that selection of, if this case, an example of a heat pump, for example. But yeah, tonality is just makes it more annoying. It also makes it more disturbing to your sleep, because I said earlier on that when we're talking about our sleep research, we know that electronic sounds with very narrow bandwidth on there are much more arousing, so they have a much higher likelihood of waking you up. So tonality fits into that space.
Jane wants to know how you can fix noise sensitivity. They're in a situation that after 2 years of excessive noise, they are now under the decibels permitted in the district plan, but still cannot sleep.
So it's sleep time disturbance. And I guess the question is whether it is a continuous part of that, or whether there is sounds in that environment that are going bang or crash that are waking you up, because they're sort of two bits. And I'll give you an example. I've got a friend of my wife's who lives in a city in here in an apartment, and it's 5:30 in the morning. A rubbish truck pulls up down below, she's several floors up, and makes a lot of noise, and it continuously woke her up. And because it would be really hard in that particular environment to improve significantly the sound isolation, she wanted some suggestions. And so the solution, and I said give it a try, was that she got her phone and she paired it with a Bluetooth speaker onto there. And because this was a sound that happens pretty much at 5:30 in the morning, plus or minus 10 minutes or 15 minutes, she set it up so that at 5:20, it basically turned on and it introduced some sound into her sleep environment of her choice. So in her case, it wasn't white noise. I wouldn't go with white noise. Something that's you would be familiar with, that you would normally enjoy, but not something you would be sitting there actively to engage with. So you introduced that sound in the environment. It just gently ramped up when she was asleep. It masked essentially the sound of the crashing rum, so it brought that below there, and it went off at about 5:40. She set up. She said took a couple of nights to get it, and she reports that it worked fantastically well for that particular scenario. Now I'm not sure it matches this one or not, but there was a I guess, a practical solution for addressing where you've got this impulsive component, and that's where noise masking when you're sleeping, particularly if it's a sound that you have control over and you can introduce in the environment. That meant that she didn't then wake up till 6:30. So from her perspective, it was a big win.
And I would also question the district's plan if they're talking decibels, because we know the Resource Management Act, as we just mentioned, doesn't have a decibel level in it.
It doesn't, but the district plans do. What the district plans do is that they refer to those standards, the New Zealand Acoustic Standards, as the basis for them to decide on what levels. And in different zones, residential, commercial, they'll have different levels, and all that guidance will be pulled from NZS 6802.
Pete wants to know how we can sleep through our own snoring, but others can't.
It's a very good one. There's a lot of research on that one. Again, because what we know from a sensory perspective is that our primitive brain realizes that it's us making that noise onto there, and so therefore, because it's us making that noise, we don't see it as something that's alerting. It's not something that we recognize as being, something that's outside us. And like many things, we basically tune it out. There's a lot of other sensory stuff that we do that for as well. But it's interesting when we're asleep, which people sort of think that we're unconscious, but our auditory brain is very much conscious. It's able to realize it's us making that sound and for most cases, tune it out. What else we've got? Port loading activities, still night, drone. Okay, so there are interesting, we have New Zealand standards for that. We have New Zealand standard that deals with port noise, helipads, which is of course in the news at the moment, particularly in Auckland and Waiheke Island and parts of Auckland. So we do have standards around the guidance. Now, the key thing about standards is they don't have any legal teeth unless they're invoked by somebody like a district plan. So they are best guidance. I'd be interested to see around that particular area in port noise, but there will be resource consents and allowable levels that the local territorial authority, the district council, will have agreed upon. But it'd be worth having a look at. What did it say? Perceived louder 3 kilometers away. Okay, so harbours are a really challenging one. We don't have time to look at acoustic modelling, but if we were looking at the modelling of noise across different things, noise across waterways, particularly with particular atmospheric conditions, it can transport that noise almost with no loss across kilometers of waterways onto there. And so although they may have their normal limits in place, and you might be 3 kilometers away and you think, well, it'll be a lot quieter because it's a long way away, not guaranteed, and particularly across water. It can essentially transport the sound with very little attenuation, unfortunately.
And there's always that acoustic modeling is very interesting. At our front porch, we can hear somebody standing like they're next door to us, and we don't know what house it even is, but we can hear them word for word if we're in the white space,
in the right spot,
in the right.
So you'll have some form of what we call acoustic lensing. So basically, likely due to the geometry of either the terrain or the buildings around you, that sound has been reflected and directed to that particular location. And of course, acoustics in performance spaces, or in fact, even in other spaces, often take advantage of what we call acoustic lensing or focusing.
And interesting with snoring, the snoring is actually one of those things we look at when we're looking at tinnitus, and the people who wake up with tinnitus worse in the morning. One of the things you want to do is check the partner's snoring, because it may be they've been in a factory level environment.
Yes, absolutely. I don't actually have any numbers on levels, but of course the other key thing is that if you're in a bed, particularly a small bed, that's really close. So it's not like you're a long way away and the person's snoring in the corner. If they were, that's probably okay. But you could imagine that you're exposed to significant noise while you're asleep, which we know is not a good thing, whether it's snoring or otherwise.
Highest level's been 110 dB.
Ooh, yeah, that's probably right up close. But even if you could get this separation, it's not going to drop much. So your whole thing is that you might be getting, while you're asleep, a daytime's worth of what would be acceptable in a workplace, which, yeah, is not a good thing.
Not a good thing. I really do want to thank you for your time, Wyatt. It was very interesting and I learned a lot. And I will have the slides out when we make sure the captioning's out. If anybody has any questions, feel free to email either myself or I think Wyatt has his email on that one and we can forward it. Cool. And I do want to thank you all for coming. And thank you very much, Wyatt. I appreciate your time.
Okay, Lisa. Cheers, guys.